Today we're going to take a look at a watch that I was really excited to get in and review. In fact, I pre-ordered it over a month ago. It is, of course, the new Speedtimer from Seiko. I went with the relatively affordable solar-powered quartz option, and of course I got the Panda dial. I've had this watch for about a week so far, and I really like it. But I'm not sure if I love it. Take a look, and then I'll see if I can tell you what I mean. Hey guys, welcome back to Just the Watch. My name's Dave. I live in Japan and I love to collect affordable watches. And partly because I live in Japan, I'm always interested in what Seiko is putting out. And when I saw that they were doing a new chronograph watch, they're gonna do it in a 39mm size with a sapphire crystal and a proper bracelet, I was pretty excited. So this watch is a reinterpretation of Seiko's 1969 Speedtimer, but when you take a look at the Panda dial version, which I have, I think more people are comparing it to the Rolex Daytona. And in a lot of ways, I feel like this does make a good budget alternative to the Daytona. It is a very different watch from the Rolex Daytona, but if you are interested in that Panda dial, maybe the Paul Newman style Daytona, but you want a good kind of non-homage watch that sort of gives you the similar feel, yeah, this is something that I think you should definitely take a look at. This watch is a part of Seiko's Prospex line. It is incredibly well built. It has just an absolutely gorgeous design. And that 39mm size wears so great on the wrist. Overall, I would say that the execution of this watch is extremely competent. There's a great deal of confidence that Seiko has in what they're doing, but at the same time, it doesn't quite feel special. And that's maybe what I was kind of hoping. At $675, this is a pretty expensive watch for me. And it's a fair deal more expensive than Seiko's entry-level Prospex watches. So I was kind of excited to see what Seiko is going to give you for that extra money. Seiko is renowned for their finishing and their dial work on their high-end watches, and I was kind of hoping that some of that might have trickled down into this watch. But I think when it comes to the finishing on this watch and the dial work and sort of the details, this has more in common with Seiko's entry-level watches than it does, you know, with their more expensive mid-priced watches that come in the $1,000 and up range. What you do get for that extra money is finally a sapphire crystal, a decent bracelet that has a nice milled clasp, solid links, and solid end links. So a lot of people complain about the mineral crystals and the cheap bracelets that Seiko gives in their affordable watches. This steps it up in that area, and maybe a little bit in the finishing department, but not as much as I would have hoped. Now the Seiko Speedtimer stock bracelet is great, but let's try a couple of straps on, and I'm going to pick out a few of these here. So I've got this tan rally strap, your classic black Horween sort of vintage style. And then let's try a burgundy kind of dress strap. That's another Horween strap. And this Artem sailcloth strap. So throughout the rest of the review, I'll be putting up some shots of the watch on these 4 straps, and then maybe circle back at the end and tell you about which one I think looks the best. And you guys can make your own decision too. So let's look at the dimensions and specifications and see what you're getting for that $675. This watch has a 39mm diameter case, 20mm lugs, 45mm lug to lug, 13.5mm tall with a lightly domed boxed sapphire crystal, 100 meters of water resistance, a solar quartz V192 movement, and again, you're looking at a $675 retail price. A lot of people seem to be concerned about the thickness of this watch. It's 13.5mm tall, but it's only a 39mm watch. And on paper, that sounds kind of chunky. But honestly, I didn't notice the thickness of this watch until I'd been wearing it for about a week when I saw someone post about it on Instagram. Some of that thickness comes from the sapphire crystal, which starts slightly above the bezel and then has a slight dome to it. And overall, I think the thickness is actually really perfect for this watch. It doesn't feel unwieldy or look overly tall, and I think it helps give the watch a little bit of extra wrist presence and a more solid feel. And while I normally prefer thin watches, I think on this watch, the thickness that they got is absolutely perfect. I wouldn't really want it any thinner than it is. Now, one of the strong points of this watch is the overall design. It is undoubtedly a gorgeous design. Everything about it exudes a certain level of confidence I think is often lacking in a lot of micro-brand watches, and a level of polish that is lacking in a lot of the cheap Chinese homage watches. Oftentimes with the micro-brands, I get the feeling that they're kind of trying too hard. They're pushing really really aggressive designs and kind of in-your-face elements to get noticed, which they kind of have to do in that segment of the market. Whereas Seiko, I feel like they know how to make a good watch, and they are just executing it to a really high level. The Panda color scheme on this watch is incredibly striking, and you don't really need to do a whole lot of other things to make it stand out. And while I was slightly underwhelmed with some aspects of the watch, there are a lot of really tiny details that really stand out that I really appreciate about this. From a functionality and comfort standpoint, the case design is outstanding. This watch just wears incredibly well on the wrist. There's no beveled edges or fancy turns to the design. It's very straightforward, kind of vintage and reminiscent of some of their older dive watches. It has a simple radial brushing across the top and then a high polish on the side, both of which is done to a high level of excellence. And there's a nice crisp distinction between the polished and brushed areas.
People often complain that Seiko doesn't sign their crowns on their lower priced watches, and they didn't sign the crown on this one. However, they did embellish it. The surface of the crown has a deeply engraved ring going around the outer edge, and then the inner portion has a nice circular brushing on it. The crown has a really good knurling that makes it very easy to grip. Would I have preferred Seiko to put their little S on the middle of it? I don't know. I kind of like the way it looks like this. This is one area where it does feel a lot more premium than the crowns that they put on their sort of entry-level watches.
The bezel on this watch is a coated stainless steel done in black. It has sort of two surfaces, a polished angle where the numerals are housed, and then a flat brushed upper surface where the hash marks are housed. All the numbers are engraved and filled with a white paint, and the printing is very crisp with no overflows or smudged edges. Coming out of that bezel, you have a boxed sapphire crystal with the edges sitting slightly above the bezel, and then a very slight dome going to the top. It gives a very subtle yet elegant look to the crystal. You do get some distortion at extreme angles, but there's a high degree of clarity and not a lot of reflections coming off of it, giving a very clear, distraction-free view down into the dial. Under the crystal, you also have a black brushed rehaut that really ties the design together, giving a really smooth transition between the crystal, the bezel, and the dial. The dial has a very subtle texture to it, just kind of a rough finish that looks really cool. With the markers being especially beautiful, they have a nice bevel on them and they're done in high polish, but they are coated black, so it does contrast incredibly well against the white dial. The applied Seiko logo at 12 o'clock is slightly raised over the dial, so it often casts some really cool shadows on the dial depending on the lighting situation, and really gives the watch kind of a premium look. Seiko is a little bit reserved on their application of lume on this watch. Rather than luming every single marker, you're only getting lume at 12, 3, 6, and 9. That, along with the lume on the hands, allows you to get a pretty good approximation of the time after dark, and this being Seiko, the lume is still excellent. In the daylight, it has kind of a warm brown tinge to it, giving it kind of a vintage feel that adds just a touch of color to the black and white scheme, and in the dark it glows a very bright blue.
For a more objective look at the lume, I went ahead and ran this against my J-Score test, pitting it against the new RZE Fortitude and the Steel Dive Captain Willard homage. And this test measures the brightness of the lume, not the area, so even though the Seiko Speedtimer here doesn't have a lot of lume on the dial, the lume that it does have is extremely bright. It came out with a score of 8, which is extremely impressive for a chronograph. For reference, my Seiko Samurai Diver scores a 10, so with a score of 8, this one's basically tied with the Seiko Sports field watch that I reviewed recently.
All of these are things that I really appreciate about this watch. The watch looks great on the wrist, and I really enjoy wearing it out. And as I mentioned before, the comfort on it is just outstanding. But at the same time, there are a number of things that kind of annoy me about this, and things that I kind of wish that Seiko would have just done a little bit differently or to a little bit higher standard. Maybe the thing that's most distracting for me is the fact that the subdials here are actually the solar cells for the watch. So this is a solar powered movement, which is awesome. It doesn't need a battery. It's going to charge itself. But because the watch is solar powered, you got to fit solar cells into this design somewhere. And this stark white dial is not going to be a place where you can put solar cells. So they put 3 of them into the subdials, which is a pretty clever thing to do. But you can tell that the subdials are solar cells. When light hits them, they reflect kind of a bluish tint. And even more noticeable is the fact that the subdials have a subtle line going through each one of them that's part of that solar cell technology. I'm also not a huge fan of the transition between the main dial and those subdials. It looks kind of like a sandwich dial design where the main dial has these 3 large cutouts for the subdials, but it's just a straight drop down into it. I would have liked to see maybe a little bit of beveling on those cutouts or something to kind of integrate the design a little bit better. Also, because this is a solar watch and because the dial is relatively thick, having to have those solar cells in there, the date is sunk down pretty deep and a little bit difficult to read a lot of times. And speaking of 3 subdials, I love the look visually, but one of those 3 subdials is a 24-hour subdial. And Maybe I don't understand the history of chronographs or something, but I just don't know why you would have a 24 subdial on a chronograph. I would have much preferred to see something like a 12-hour totalizer so that this watch could track up to 12 hours on the chronograph rather than just 60 minutes. Or if you're going to put a 24-hour subdial on there, why can't you make it independently adjustable so that you can track 2 time zones on the watch and make it actually useful? If any of you guys know in the comments why Seiko does this, definitely let me know.
One last thing to note, while the bracelet is very high quality with solid links, solid end links, and a great milled clasp, it does only have 2 micro adjusts. I like the look of this kind of smaller, slimmer clasp, but I really would have preferred to have at least 3, maybe 4 micro adjusts on there. As it is, I was able to get a really good fit on the bracelet from my wrist right now, but when the weather warms up and my wrist swells a little bit, I'm probably going to have to add a link, which will be kind of a pain.
So let's talk about the movement in this watch. This is the Seiko Caliber V192. The main feature of this is that it is a solar-powered movement, so you're going to be able to use this watch, you know, for decades without having to worry about battery changes or things like that. The large second hand for the watch is tied to the chronograph, so it remains stationary at 12 o'clock until you activate it. And when you do get a very smooth 5 ticks per second sweep on it, and that combined with the detailed 1/5 of a second track allows you to actually track things down to 1/5 of a second if your eyes are good enough to actually read it. Another cool thing is that the 60-minute counter ticks once per minute. On a lot of other quartz chronographs that I've seen, the 60-minute counter kind of moves smoothly along with the second hand, often making it difficult to tell which minute the hand is pointing to, but this one will always snap to each minute marker and it lines up pretty well, so that does help with legibility there. Another cool thing about this movement is that it integrates a power reserve indicator into that 60-minute chronograph counter subdial. When the chronograph is not activated, normally that 60-minute counter subdial is not going to be in use, so Seiko has repurposed it to show the level of charge that the watch has. So it has an F and an E for full and empty. Also worth noting is that the action on the chronograph buttons is really good, particularly for a quartz chronograph. Again, it's not the same as a mechanical. I've heard some people calling this a mecha quartz chronograph. This is not a mecha quartz, it's just a quartz chronograph. You're not going to get as tactile a feeling on the button activations, but it's not bad. It's pretty good. Wrapping back around to talk about straps, you've seen some of them as the video has been through, and this watch really does look good on a pretty wide range of straps. Right now I'm really in love with it on this sort of burgundy Horween leather strap. I think it just gives such a classy look, but it also looks great on that Artem sailcloth, kind of a really sporty, maybe more techie kind of look. But yeah, with that 20mm lugs, you could swap out to a lot of different straps and have a lot of fun with this watch. But you wouldn't necessarily need to because the bracelet is a pretty good bracelet. So to wrap all this up, let's talk about that price tag again, $675. I feel like this is a really well-built watch. Like this is, I think, a tool watch. This is a watch that makes a great case for a watch that you could wear every day, that you would want to wear every day, and you would have no reservations about wearing it every day. And so for some people, it might be worth that $675, particularly people who are interested in Seiko or in a really well-built Panda dial chronograph. But that said, I feel like Seiko could have gone just a little bit further to make this feel like something more special, maybe a little bit better finishing, a little bit more interest in the case design. Seems like Seiko didn't really feel any pressure to go the extra mile, but it would have been nice to see them do it anyways. I was able to get mine at about $500 with the pre-order price, and I think at that price it's definitely worth it. But at the full retail price, it is something I think you're going to have to think about and sort of weigh the pros and cons. For me personally, if I'm spending around $600 on a watch, I want it to feel like something really special and personal and cool. Whereas again, it feels like this one is just a very competent, very well-built tool watch.
But despite that, the watch has a ton of personality and character. It's incredibly well made and a joy to wear. So in that sense, I don't know, maybe it is kind of a special watch.
Anyways, I'm still trying to work through all that, but drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of this watch. But that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you later. Bye.